stop talking and so on. And I have a pleasure to introduce you to our next speaker, keynote speaker, Professor Tanja Johansson. Tanja is a relatively new professor of arts management here at the SibA Academy, and she's the only one in Finland. In addition to be a professor, she is also the director of the Mutri Doctoral School, and she will soon start as the Vice Dean for the Faculty of Music Education, Jazz and Folk Music. Professor Johansson has a strong background in both music and business administration. Her research interests consist of opera management and critical management studies. In addition, she is interested in the institutional context of art organizations, the role of festivals in regional development, and organizational ethnography. She has published in most leading arts management journals. Professor Johansson also works for an EU-funded project called Higher Education Institutions for Societal Engagement. And today she will give a talk entitled Managing Joint Ventures in the Performing Arts, an Identity View. So, welcome, Tanja.
Thank you, Ture, for your nice introduction. So, good afternoon, everybody. Nice to be here, and nice to talk about things that I have been interested in for so long. So, as Ture said, my topic today is Managing Joint Venture in the Performing Arts, an Identity View. This is based on a study that I conducted with my long-time research fellow, Annika Jurma from the Estonian Academy of Music and Theatre. In this study, I have been able to continue to examine my favorite subject, namely identities, and particularly organizational identities. So I will talk about organizational identities within joint ventures, a concept that I will define a bit later in more detail, but say at this point that actually we are currently sitting in a joint venture in the performing arts, namely the Helsinki Music Centre. Joint ventures as a mode of collaboration have become increasingly important operational structure in the cultural and creative sector. This is largely due to uncertainties in public funding, increased competition in outreach to audiences, and the ongoing search for new artistic contents and innovative programming through collaboration, cooperation, and co-productions. The structural and economic aspects of joint ventures are important to understand, and these aspects have already received attention in the literature. But the issues of identities within inter-organizational collaboration must also be considered in the successful management of such collaborative efforts. So I will talk about 45 minutes, and then we will have at least 15 minutes for your questions, comments, discussions. And Ture has kindly promised to chair the discussion. So these are the topics I will touch upon today. I will start exploring the relational view on identities in organizations and then define the joint ventures in the field of performing arts, or what I sometimes call cultural joint ventures. I will also explain why I want to use this particular term and what might be the advantages of using it. After that, I will start a more practical part where I will present some joint venture cases that have been analyzed in our study. And finally, I will present some conclusions and implications of managing those collaborative efforts. I thought that in the beginning I tried to be abstract and theoretical enough to create opportunities for reflection for as many as possible interested in identities, and in the end try to be more concrete with my conclusions. So let's start with the identities. As we all know, identity is a widely used concept that has generated a range of studies across disciplines such as sociology, psychology, and philosophy. Each discipline tends to put emphasis on different approaches, and this has contributed to a great variation in terminology and the level of analysis used. In organisation studies, identities have become an increasingly popular research topic that has contributed to a varied exploration of organisational life and organising. Since the path-breaking study on organisational identity by Stuart Albert and David Wethen in 1985, various philosophical, theoretical and methodological approaches have been applied in studies on that particular subject matter. So compared to other disciplines, identities in organisation studies is not that old research field yet. So, the different approaches to identities have moved between the monolithic and multiple identities, as well as between the essentialist and constructed or discursive approaches to identities. However, it's not like earlier identities were solid and nowadays they are fluid. Rather, it means that when the complexity of organising has increased in our contemporary society, the resources for identity construction have become more diverse. This is a central ground for me for understanding identities in joint ventures, as joint activities often adds to the complexity of organising. So there are different ways to distinguish various identity approaches, and I'm here presenting three approaches, each referring to different ways of defining and studying identities. First, the functionalist approach. It tends to conceptualize identity as something that people, groups or organizations have, a certain essence that provides the true self. For example, we could study how the organizational identity, defined as a certain type of identity, influences managerial outcomes and thus potentially the improved organizational effectiveness. Then interpretive studies on identities are interested in the meanings people attach to themselves, to others, to the groups they belong to, or to organizations they work at. These meanings are socially and symbolically constructed. From this point of view, there is not one identity that can be captured by a researcher, but there are different views a person, a group, or an organization brings forward. However, these views are not fixed, but constructed and even contested in social interaction. As you can see, these two approaches differ quite significantly from each other. Then the third approach, called here postmodern or critical views, question the existence of essentially rational and coherent identity and highlight the complex and contradictory character of multiple identities. So individuals, groups or organizational members make sense of themselves, their group or their organization through discursive practices. These discursive practices include also various symbolic resources than linguistics alone. I myself tend to follow the definition presented here, saying identities are emerging from the ongoing interaction between multiple and potentially contradictory identities creating a dynamic and dialectic struggle between being and becoming. The research on organizational identities has usually focused either on the individual or the collective levels, and the interpersonal level has been mostly ignored. The relational identity approach provides an integrative construct that can help to integrate the different levels of identities, or in other words, to overcome the clear distinction between individual and collective. Also, when understanding organizational identities as discursively constructed phenomena, the dynamic nature of these discursive practices make distinctions between individual and collective unnecessarily restrictive. I would argue that a relational understanding of organizational identities enables to look at the both levels without making a clear separation between them. So, relational identities refer here to so-called intersubjective meaning-making processes through which identities are constructed. In practice, this means that we attach meanings to different aspects of ourselves, others, and the organizations in relation to different values, beliefs, and feelings, for instance. People may relate multiple meanings to their organization, some of which are shared and some of which are contradictory. Hence, different variations of the shared meanings can exist simultaneously in organizations. In addition, Alveson argues that people may not have fixed meanings related to the organization, but they can take temporary views on a particular issue and also express uncertainty concerning the meanings. These meaning-making processes are shaped and influenced by the relations people have with each other and the relations they have to their organization, but also to its broader environment. This view on identities highlights also that different meanings are constructed in discursive practices through different types of texts. However, these texts do not only refer to spoken language, but also to other symbolic and aesthetic aspects which act as resources in our discursive practices. Here are some examples of those resources that we may use while constructing identities. Physical settings, buildings, arts organizations. Many of the arts organizations are that kind of significant buildings, such as Guggenheim Bilbao Museum, just as an example, or physical setting in terms of, for instance, a stage area and who are allowed to enter the stage area, for instance, in an opera house. Or then time-related aspects. We hear and we might narrate those nostalgic stories about our organizations and the other groups, etc. Or geographical division. Or different symbolic and aesthetic aspects, such as clothing, logos of the organizations, or other aesthetic resources. I remember one very interesting doctoral thesis written years ago in Turku University, written by Anni Paalumäki. It was called Follow the Yellow, in Finnish Keltaisella johdetut. And it was a case study about SOL cleaning services. I think you all know that, and how important the color yellow is for the brand. But also, it was a really important part of the organizational identity construction, the color yellow. Okay, now we are moving to the second part, talking about the joint ventures, after I will kind of combine the two views. So, what are the joint ventures in performing arts? Joint venture refers to collaborations in which the formal control and ownership structure is multi-layered. A joint venture can thus be defined as a contractual arrangement that creates a separate legal entity in which the affiliate organization holds ownership interests. In joint venture partnering, the partners working both independently and interdependently, but there is some kind of contractual way of governing, particularly the joint activities. In most cultural joint ventures, there is no formal merger or acquisition happening, and that's why quite many joint ventures can be called also as strategic alliances, defined as purposive relationships between two or more independent organizations that involve the exchange, sharing, or co-development of resources or capabilities to achieve mutually relevant benefits. But why do I want to use this particular concept then? I would say that in addition to the traditional resources for identity construction presented earlier, this concept of joint ventures brings in the level of ownership and governing system and its influence on inter-organizational identities. In other words, the concept enables the inter-organizational level of identity construction, which has not been explored too much, even if the inter-organizational collaboration has increased in recent years. And of course, there are limitations to this concept, as there are in every concept. So I would be very careful not to look at the inter-organizational level only, without integrating it into the identity resources in other levels. But to be more concrete and more clear what we mean by joint ventures in performing arts, so I will now talk about certain cases. I will talk about Helsinki Music Center, Harpa in Reykjavik, Iceland, Auckland Live in Auckland, New Zealand, and DR Konserthuset in Copenhagen, and then Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts in New York. But let's start with the Helsinki Music Center that we are all very familiar with. I would say that this is a classical example of a joint venture in which three independent organizations share premises as well as some artistic and administrative practices. There is also a for-profit management company that facilitates the interaction, takes care of the building, negotiates with the different service providers, and provides marketing and production services. But if we are only looking at that level, this is kind of my argument that then we miss what the ownership and governing model brings to the identity constructions. So taking into account the governmental level of these four organizations adds to how identities are constructed here in the Helsinki Music Center. Then Harpa in Reykjavik. It was opened actually the same year as the Helsinki Music Center, so in 2011. Harpa involves Iceland Symphony Orchestra, the Icelandic Opera, the Reykjavik Big Band, and the management company. So rather similar to this building. The ownership structure is a bit different. State is very much involved, and also the city of Reykjavik, being the main owners of the management company. Based on our interviews, there were many similarities in the identity construction, particularly in the beginning of this joint venturing. Just before the move to the new building, the performing arts organizations tried to strengthen their individual identities, for example, by renewing their websites and the visual images. Also, similar struggles about the role of the for-profit management company and whether the house itself should have an artistic vision and who the house was actually targeted for. These struggles were very much shared between the Helsinki Music Center and Harpa. The next one, there are a bit more organizations collaborating here. Auckland Live is kind of an Auckland home for New Zealand's national and regional arts companies, but also for the hub of various festivals. So, New Zealand Symphony Orchestra, Opera, Auckland City Orchestra, the Royal New Zealand Ballet, Chamber Music, New Zealand, but also 3 different festivals which add another layer to that organization. And as in the previous 2 cases, there is a management company. A central part of this joint venturing is the management company, to hold it all together. It is a landlord for these different organizations owned by the city. And in addition to managing the venues, it supports each organization marketing campaigns to reach the local audiences. So, mainly focusing on marketing activities, but also different productional aspects. Yet another example from Copenhagen, DR Koncerthuset. DR comes from Danish radio. It was opened in 2009. DR, Danish Radio, is an independent, license-funded public service organization. This is a bit different joint venture case compared to other examples because DR Koncerthuset is governed as part of the broadcasting company, and all the different orchestras and choirs are owned 100% by the Danish broadcasting company. So these are the organizations that DR Koncerthuset houses, so to say. Many orchestras and many choirs. The management of the Koncerthuset is not organized through an independent company, but is part of the management system of Danish radio. However, which is quite interesting, there seems to be some of similar identity struggle between these collaborating organizations that we have seen in other cases as well. Before going to more analytical insights from these cases, I will present one more example. And perhaps the most famous example of a cultural joint venture, Lincoln Center in New York. Having a long and exceptional history in forming this huge complex of various arts organizations, the starting point was similar to other examples actually. The organizations that originally created the joint venture were first independent organizations, after which they started to collaborate. First sharing spaces and afterwards increasing collaboration in other matters as well. What is interesting here is that Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts Incorporation runs this cultural joint venture. This private organization is both the landlord and administrator for the 12 organizations housed within Lincoln Center. I'm not going to read all the organizations here. You can do that by yourself. But as you know, a huge complex of different organizations. From the management point of view, while the resident organizations, these 12, retain their own autonomous management, the groups do share the funds, Lincoln Center raises, as we are in the US, collaborate in marketing efforts quite a lot and are represented on Lincoln Center's board of directors. What does these examples reveal from the identity point of view then? The cases have in common that in the beginning of joint venturing, when the independent organizations came together for the first time to share spaces and some activities, the identity levels were suddenly multiplied and the resources for identity construction increased tremendously. However, the increased number of identity resources does not mean that they would be instantly shared or people would have a positive relation to them. Instead, it seems that people relate positively to some resources available, such as new facilities that enable better work conditions, but may unrelate or even disrelate to other resources. Unrelating refers here to uninteresting sources that people find non-relevant or simply insignificant to have any impact on them. For example, in the beginning of joint venturing, the shared marketing efforts provided by the management company were this type of resources, particularly in the beginning, and people didn't see the value of those. Then disrelating refers to negatively experienced resources that people do not agree with or are even against to. For example, it was common for the joint organizations to disrelate to their management company. This variety of identity resources and the variety of how people may relate to these resources in a net of identities is one of the key things I want to emphasize today. That has also certain managerial implications, and I will now turn into those. Basically, I have two main conclusions in addition to those different levels of relating. I want to point out, and then would be very much like to open the discussion and hear, for instance, about your experiences in working in cultural joint ventures. So, firstly, I would conclude that in cultural joint ventures, enough time has to be allocated to get to know each party's ways of working, how they approach their art form, and how they see their place in the art field. I would cover at least these type of questions. What are the joint activities in short and long term that we are aiming at together? What are the key values that the joint activities are based on? And who do we serve? And what is our relationship to audience? Because that might differ between the organizations. And last but not least, what is the role of profit within this joint venture? Particularly the last question was not discussed in either cases in the beginning, and that was one of the key resources that people disrelated to. What is the role of profit? Of course, it varies. It varies particularly within these type of joint venture where there are public organizations, private organizations, and perhaps hybrid organizations in between. So, discussing what is the role of profit, having some kind of shared understanding of that is one of the key things, but quite often forgotten. My second conclusion here, based on the case studies, so I would conclude that partners should collaborate on both artistic and administrative contents. Very often these cases, the joint practices were focusing on marketing, but particularly in the beginning. So it was difficult to find time to create these joint administrative activities as they were not considered as crucial as the own organization's marketing efforts, for instance. But what they did in Harpa, it was quite interesting. A couple of years after the opening, they realized that it would be beneficial for the entire house to have a group of people considering the artistic vision of the whole house. Then they named this group, named it as Artistic Board of Harpa, and here you will see the members of this group. The group consists not only from the people working at Harpa, but also outside working for different interest organizations within the arts field. And this was a crucial moment for Harpa to find collaboration between the different organizations. That was meaningful enough to collaborate with. So this type of collaborative work on artistic matters provides new joint and positively experienced resources for identity construction, and more importantly, provides resources that are meaningful to the members of joint venturing organizations. In the long run, it matters whether the independent organizations are able to create enough shared resources for building their identities. And not only the number of shared resources matter, it is also a question of quality of these resources, and to have resources that are meaningful to a range of people.